Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Little Horn series. We're on episode 3 today, and today we're going to look at who is the Little Horn, or what is the Little Horn, and I'm going to do it today from the futurist perspective. Now, I know I've done a lot of videos sort of talking about a lot of futurist ideas, and I just want to say I'm not saying that these people are stupid by any means. There are a lot of wonderful, intelligent people out there who are futurists, but my approach has always been to investigate the evidence for yourself. It's quite surprising how many things we assume to be true, because that's what we've been told all our lives. So my motto has always been investigate the scriptures for yourself, try to come to the conclusions as best as you can with God's help, and then present it to the public. So that's my aim today. So I'm not telling you to believe this. I'm just wanting to present it, and you can make up your own mind. So, who is the Little Horn, according to the futurists? Well, before you give a answer on who the Little Horn is, there are 10 things that you would have to consider before you give your identification, and they are presented to us in chapter 7 of Daniel, and I'll just go through them very quickly. Number 1, a little horn, the king. Number 2, it comes up from among the 10 horns. 3 other horns are pulled, uprooted because of it. It has eyes and mouth, speaking great things. Speaks out against the Most High. Now, here's where the sequence comes in. It arises after the 4th kingdom, so that's Rome, the 4th beast, and after the 10 horns of the beast. It's different from the other horns. It persecutes the saints, in other words, the Christians, God's people. It intends to make alterations in times and law, and the saints are given into its hand for a time, times, and half a time. So no matter how you interpret it, you would have to consider those 10 characterizations before you come to a conclusion. Alright, also the other thing we have to consider is that sequence of events we see from Daniel 7. We have the 4 pieces of metal, which then transforms into clay and iron feet, and then in the beast, the 4 beasts, we have the 4th beast, the 10 horns, and then the little horn comes up. Now, at both of those moments in chapter 2 and chapter 7, we see sort of a heaven intervention at that point, and that is in chapter 2, the rock comes down and smashes the image of the legs, breaking the 10 toes, and then the other parts of the metal sort of get blown into the wind. And then that rock turns into a great mountain. Now, most people interpret that rock to mean Jesus Christ. He comes down and smashes the images of these satanic kingdoms. Then in Daniel chapter 7, it talks about the Ancient of Days was sat on his throne, and he was about to get ready to judge the world. Books were open. And then it talks about in verse 13, I saw one like a son of man come in the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One. And a lot of people interpret that to mean Jesus. Now, I'm going to do another video about those moments in Daniel 2 and 7, because most interpretations regard that as the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, that automatically places it into a future context. So, go into the futurist interpretation. Who would it be talking about where it would speak blasphemies against God, persecute the saints, make alterations to the law and God's word, and of course the one conclusion they come to, because it's dealing with the time of judgment, the end days, is the Antichrist. The Little Horn is also a title for the Antichrist. And then funny enough, on most internet searches, whenever you type in what is the Little Horn, the vast majority of them will come up claiming that it is referring to a future Antichrist who will persecute God's people. Alright, let's unpack this. Let's see if this is true. I'm just following the sequence from an article I'm reading here. Now, we know that the 4th beast represents the Roman Empire, and then it talks about the little horn came up from the 10 horns from that beast. Now, the thing is, you would have to place a huge 2,000-year gap from the Roman Empire all the way down to the end of the world with the Antichrist. Now, when you read Daniel 7, especially if we go by the historicist approach, at least historicism connects in the timeline the 10 horns, which represent the 10 kingdoms of Western Rome, and then the little horn came up among them. Now that takes you down a timeline. Now with the futurist view, you just place a gap right after the fourth beast. Now that's exactly what they do in Daniel chapter 9, when we see the angel Gabriel give Daniel a vision about the 70 weeks. Now this was mentioned in the movie, and I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but just to say what dispensationalists and futurists do is that they go through the 7 weeks, the 62 weeks, and then they place this mystery gap after the 62nd week and claim that those last remaining 7 years will only happen when the rapture takes place. We see that gap there. We can also see that gap in Daniel 7. There is just this big mystery gap after the fourth beast, and if you want to connect it to the Antichrist, there is no logical explanation to put that gap there. And in fact, in Daniel 9, there's no indication from that passage that you have to stop the clock. You have to pause the prophetic time. It makes more sense in Daniel 9 that it is a consecutive 490-year prophetic time period leading up to Jesus Christ. And I don't want to get into this because I've already covered it, but the one who will remove the sacrifices from the temple and cause them to cease, that is talking about Jesus abolishing the sacrifices because he was the final sacrifice. It does not refer to an Antichrist rebuilding a third temple and then stopping sacrifices, which would have had to have restart. And also, as we've also talked about, a third temple would deny Jesus. It would deny that he is the final sacrifice. Alright, another claim is that they believe the Antichrist will sort of emerge from Europe in the European coalition. I know Dr. David Jeremiah talks about this a lot on his YouTube channels, but basically the idea is the little horn emerges from the fourth beast, which is Rome, remember, and that suggests to many people that there will be some sort of revival of the old Roman Empire in the end times. But I think one of the problems with that is that Revelation talks about Babylon. Now, Babylon was the literal place, but in spiritual terminology, Rome, the Roman Empire, was Babylon in the book of Revelation. Now, Revelation says Babylon has fallen. Oh, Babylon the Great has fallen. Now, that proclamation there sort of tells me that is a fallen forever with no revival. If we're claiming it's going to revive in the end times, that would sort of go against the message of the book of Revelation there. Then another claim about the Antichrist is that a lot of futurists suggest that the 10 horns would not represent the Western Roman Empire, which we've seen from the previous video, but rather they claim that it represents 10 world leaders, and the Antichrist will sort of make his move. He will, rise up slowly and subtly. He will eliminate 3 of them, and then he will make himself the dominant power, leading to become this great tyrant, brutal figure. That's what a lot of people claim Revelation 13 is about. But briefly on Revelation 13, I've already shared this in another video. The 666 mark of the beast, was referring to the Emperor Nero in the 1st century. And if not the Emperor Nero, if you don't want to go down that interpretation, remember, we're not talking about a literal mark. We're talking spiritually how God would distinct and set his people aside from the world. He would put a spiritual mark on them, so to speak, so he could see them standing out from the crowd in the rest of the world. That imagery comes from the mark Passover in Exodus, and we see it in Revelation chapter 7. So it's not a literal mark. It has nothing to do with tattoos, computer chips, etc. And the other problem with that, of course, the horns sort of represent kingdoms, and I know those kingdoms had kings, but this interpretation is saying that there will be specific people who will sort of rise to power, and the Antichrist will eliminate them. I know it talks about eyes and a mouth speaking great blasphemies, but that can also be interpreted on a kingdom level. Kingdoms and empires that oppose God and speak blasphemies against him. Revelation 17 and 18 talks about old Babylon, that great harlot, has drunk the blood of the wine of the saint and spoken out against the most holy God. And so you can interpret that on a kingdom level as well. And also, the only time that I'm aware of that a horn is connected to a human being is in Daniel chapter 8, where Daniel sees the goat, which represents Greece, we're told. It has one horn in between its eyes, and he's told there that represents the first king of that kingdom, which was Alexander the Great. And then it merges into 4 horns, which represents when the Greek Empire was split into 4 kingdoms. That's one problem with it. And the other problem with it, again, it sort of separates the timeline from the 4th beast, and then there's sort of no consistent connection. It just cuts the timeline and shoves those 10 horns way into the future with no direct sequence. So again, we're talking about this mystery gap that's just thrown into the mix. Alright, something else that is interesting is in Daniel 7, chapter 25, where it says, he will seek to change the times and the laws, and then the saints will be handed over to him for a time, times and half a time. The futurist interpretation of that is that they take it almost sort of literally, which is year, 2 years, and half a year, leading to 3.5 years. And of course, what they do is they connect those 3.5 years with the last 7 years, the last 70th week of Daniel, and say that is the second half of the tribulation period. So unlike the historicists who count up the literal days of the years to bring it to 1,260 years, they keep it to strictly 3.5 years. And so the question is, what does time and times and time, half a time, refer to? Is it 3.5 years, or is it 1,260 years? Well, in the book of Revelation, that phrase and different ways of saying it is brought up a couple of times. And in the book of Revelation, it always seems to be referring to 3.5 years, because the phrase actually is used 1,260 days, not 1,260 years. We also see 42 months. All those, there are different ways of saying it, but they all basically come to 3.5 years. Now, in the book of Revelation, there is no sort of chronological connection with those timelines. It's almost as if they're used as a theological and spiritual point, brought up in different places here and there. Now, I just wonder, do they refer in a spiritual sense to the timeline of Jesus? The 3.5 year period where Jesus was alive when his ministry started. Does it refer to that kind of spiritual point? So yeah, I suppose how one defined times and half a time may determine how you would interpret the little horn. I suppose again you could understand why a lot of people claim you could find the Antichrist here in this section of Daniel, but I would also want to remind us how much later these ideas were added into the Bible: the rise of dispensationalism, the rapture, Darby, and then certainly in the Reformation time when lots of theories about the Antichrist came in. I just go back to 1 John, many Antichrists have come and they were already at work, and also the man of sin who is already at work from 2 Thessalonians. We're talking about people who just oppose Christ, who are against Christ, and rather than turn into what seems to have happened in the Christian interpretive tradition, that some future one-man Antichrist is going to come at the end of the world. You can understand how people may have got there, but I think if you come back to the text, that's not sustained or supported when you read it.